Welcome to Withholding Nothing, your go-to podcast for all things tax and technology. With your hosts, Jessica Seltzer and Kai Kiriak. We are here to break down complex compliance topics, explore the latest industry trends, and have candid conversations with experts who know about tax reporting inside and out. Whether you're deep in the trenches of tax operations or just trying to keep up with the evolving regulations, Withholding Nothing is here to keep you informed and maybe even entertained along the way. On this episode, Stop the Data Bleed, Death by Documentation, we're kicking things off with a discussion on documentation challenges. As tax regulations continue to shift, organizations are facing increased pressure to ensure their documentation is not only accurate, but also aligned with new compliance regulations. And to help us navigate complex landscapes, we're thrilled to be joined by two incredible guests, Jessalyn Dean from Ledgible and Wendy Walker from SOVOS. Both bring extensive experience in tax compliance and technology, and they'll be sharing their insights on what companies should be doing right now to stay ahead. So whether you're a tax pro, a tech enthusiast, just here for the expert insights, you won't want to miss this conversation. Let's jump right in.
Thank you, Kai. I'm Wendy Walker. I'm a VP at Reg Affairs at SOVOS. I'm very excited to be a part of this inaugural podcast, and particularly because I get to talk to my friends, two of the industry's brightest and most experienced minds in information reporting and withholding, Jessica and Jessalyn. I'm going to set the stage for our conversation today so that our listeners understand the context of some of the strategies that we're going to discuss. The IRS released final regulations in June of 2024 that amended the Section 6045 of the tax law, requiring reporting of digital asset payments on the new Form 1099-DA starting with 2025 transactions. There are over 41 different information returns, and all of them include boxes to report a recipient's legal name, tax identification number, and mailing address. Section 6045, where the 1099-DA rules were added, it requires a payer to collect a certified TIN on Form W-9, or if the payee is a non-U.S. taxpayer, to collect a valid W-8 that proves that they're foreign. Issuers face penalties under Section 6721 and 6722 for filing incorrect 1099s, including those that have missing or invalid TINs. For 2025, the penalty is up to $660 per return if it's not corrected by August 1st, meaning $330 under Section 6721 and $330 under 6722. Treasury Regs 301-6724-1, they allow a penalty abatement if the issuer can show that they acted responsibly, such as collecting a TIN within 12 months of engaging the payee, and following the backup withholding process when the IRS flags a TIN error, which includes requesting a corrected W-9, and if that's not provided, backup withholding 24% from the payments. Additionally, under Section 3406, issuers must withhold 24% if a TIN is missing at the time of payment. The IRS recognized that brokers may not have the required Forms W-8 or W-9 on file for their customers that are going to receive a 1099-DA for 2025 transactions, so they issued Notice 2024-56. And that notice provides relief from the 24% backup withholding, but only if the broker performs TIN matching on any payees that do not provide a valid W-9. So the bottom line, first, you must collect valid W-8 and W-9 forms to document the U.S. or foreign tax status of any payee that will receive a Form 1099-DA. Second, you must collect valid W-9 and W-8 forms to avoid the 24% backup withholding liability that is required anytime you make a payment that can't be associated with a valid document. Remember, your company is personally liable for any withholding taxes that weren't applied when they were required. For 2025 transactions, you can forgo the backup withholding requirement as long as you perform TIN matching before you issue the 1099-DA. And that relief, though, it's only for 1099-DA transactions. That relief is not applicable to, say, staking rewards or other income that you're paying that you would need to report on a 2025 1099 miscellaneous form or 1099 NEC form or other return. So you need to get valid documentation for any other payment. That the relief is only for the 1099-DA returns. I know that was a lot of information to set the stage, but super important for people to understand the various nuances in the tax law that cross over one another here, and then, of course, what that means in terms of how an organization is going to comply. So, Jessica, I'm going to need to turn it over to you now. Where should we start this conversation today?
Yeah, thanks, Wendy. And something to keep in mind with this podcast, that was a great high level overview. And we're going to try to stay as far out of the tax technical weeds as we can and try to talk practical. But it's super important to have the background as to why all of this stuff matters at the end of the day. So, when we're thinking about the regs and the requirements that Wendy just mentioned, when we start talking about the best place to start for collecting W-8s and W-9s, it's often pretty daunting for clients to figure out where to start, especially if we're looking at high volume clients. Typically, the best thing a client can do is first and foremost have internal conversations. So, what I mean by that is, yes, we're talking tax nuance, we're talking tax regulations, but when we start talking about customer facing technology or processes to collect sensitive information, you start to think about the security folks getting involved because we're collecting PII. You start thinking about product folks getting involved because maybe you want to integrate this into an existing onboarding process. You start thinking about other areas and lines of business that may get involved, and it's important to have alignment across product, tax, engineering, security to make sure everyone's on board because that's also going to create a process that minimizes customer friction at the end of the day. So maybe that customer friction also looks like soft launches, right? No one's saying you have to go big or go home tomorrow. Important thing is to put a sustainable process in place, and maybe that looks like a soft launch, for example, to get feedback from some critical customers to incorporate that into an existing process. So those are just a few, I don't know, ideas off the top of my head to think about at least where to start having the conversations. And then when it comes to actually deploying a solution, it's typically I urge businesses to look at it in two different work streams. You have your historical current customers, but then you also have your new customers, and the approach may look different for those, especially in light of some of the regulations and the transition relief, for example, that Wendy just mentioned. So for those historical current customers, assuming you perhaps have tens on file, maybe the solution for those for now is to simply start off by 10 checking, right? A big point Wendy was making in those regulations and that transition relief is you need to 10 check. You need to have a valid 10 on file. So instead of repapering all of your historical or current customers, maybe the best place to start is 10 checking and using that to determine who you repaper versus I think implementing a full on W8, W9 collection process on a go forward basis, meaning new customers. I think Jessalyn said it best. We were all talking previously, and I think Jessalyn said every new customer becomes a remediation effort. And I think that really, I almost want to stitch that on a pillow. I really like that. That stuck with me. And I think that emphasizes that you have this continuous target that you effectively have to find a way to get a hold of. And if you can try to launch something to account for those two work streams, the new, and then the existing slash historical, I think by compartmentalizing those, it might seem like a little bit of a less daunting approach. Those are my thoughts. Open to the floor.
I wanted to add that alignment across the different lines of business and minimizing friction for customers also aligns with the idea that tax is not the only reason that we ask for some of this information. Like, if I think about a business process and we're going to be collecting a name and a tax ID number, If the business is already doing that in other instances, the question is, why are we already collecting this and for what purpose are we using it? Because you really have to make sure that you're aligning what processes you are about to disrupt or change or improve with processes that are already operating. So if you think of tax information reporting in a silo, then you're going to miss those overlaps. And what happens when you miss those things overlap? You create friction for the customer. They've already been asked for their social security number, and then 5 days later, they get asked for it again or in some other format or with some new certification because these two teams within the organization simply weren't understanding the other areas in which this information gets requested and validated.
I would like to take that a step further, Jessalyn, because I used to work in financial services, and that was exactly the issue. The regulatory compliance area was required for KYC purposes to collect TINs from customers that were onboarding or collect updated information for customers that changed their information. However, that list of documents that they were collecting and validating didn't include tax information. And so certainly here we came later on as the tax team trying to paper those accounts, and those clients were like, geez, I just gave you all this, documentation. Why can't you use that information? So I think it became very important for me in practice as an operational leader to ensure that when I had to collect documentation like a W-8 or W-9, that I collaborated with the regulatory compliance team so that that form, the W-8 or the W-9, was listed as a required document for KYC. And that way we weren't having to go to the customer, and through two different processes to collect that information.
I had an experience recently where we think about onboarding new customers and asking them for a W-8 or W-9 versus the remediation effort. As Jessica mentioned, if we think about stopping the bleeding, like every day that I don't have a good process in place to onboard new customers, that day's customers become a remediation effort. And in one example that I had, I was going to start quote, remediating a pool of taxpayers. And rather than just going to the customer support team and start collecting W-8s, W-9s from these people, I first reached out to the compliance department. I said, I've got a list of people. Do you have any other reason that you are about to contact them or you have recently contacted them? And they're like, wow, we're so happy you just reached out, because actually a big pool of them are people for which there is no social security number on file at all, rather than an incomplete one or a bad one. And they were 1 week away from contacting these people. So it was good to find out that we were both about to remediate similar pools of people for different reasons so that we in one go.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because having the conversations up front with these different lines of business or departments, if you will, it allows you to create a streamlined and centralized approach to doing this. And I think that's what creates a sustainable business model at the end of the day. And all of this has to be sustainable because it's not a one-time event. Documentation is not just, hey, you do it today and it's over and done with. This has to be a sustainable. We all did a webinar several months back, and in doing that webinar, something that came up was really the life cycle of a customer. And yes, we start at onboarding. Maybe they're a new customer, right? But the point being that those historical and active customers actually end up going back through that whole life cycle to the beginning. And in doing that, that means you have to monitor for expiration if we're talking W-8s. That means you have to monitor for changes in circumstance that could cause form expiration. Maybe they changed their last name and maybe they didn't tell you, right? So you need processes in place to bulk 10 check at periods of time as a safety net. All of that's really important to create this sustainable and centralized model at the end of the day. And I think one point that Wendy was making around transition relief, that transition relief, yes, it applies to 10 checking and it applies to a specific type of income. But if you're only waiting until that income becomes reportable, or you're creating that reportable event, you better have really good processes in place to know internally when that's occurring, when they hit that threshold, when all of a sudden you stopped paying them this and paid them that. Understanding when that reportable event happens, that can create a lot of gaps in a sustainable system, instead of perhaps just considering, hey, if I just collect the W-8, W-9 from everyone up front, that creates a centralized, sustainable process versus something that's particularly piecemeal across product lines or across thresholds and things like that.
I think it's a fantastic point that you make because I think that, you have an issue of records, sitting in the onboarding part of the process. Maybe, shortly after they onboard, they're providing documentation. But, one of the things I mentioned early on is also that, if you file a Form 1099 with incorrect name TIN information, you can receive a notice from the IRS that will require you to solicit the payees for new W-9 information or backup withhold 24% if they don't respond. And so I think in the sustainable process that you were describing, Jessica, it's really important that we not only have the onboarding piece covered, but that later on, if we're notified and we have to collect new information, that we send them right back through that process again, right? That we, not just send the letter, but that when the W-9 comes back through, that it comes through that same process to be validated, stored, and et cetera, in the books and records.
Maybe another thing I can add to this, talking about that alignment across LOBs. What we're talking about is tax code and tax law. And so a lot of times the person that's in charge of directing all of this and pushing out requirements is a tax SME. It's the natural fit. However, and I love my tax people, I am a tax person myself, they are not trained in customer service. And a lot of people that have a tax background come from a corporate tax background where they're dealing with the corporate taxes of the company. Tax information reporting is a direct relationship with the customers of the business and how they experience that business. It can make or break customer acquisition and customer retention. So making sure that you don't just have alignment across LOBs, but you actually have a stakeholder committee where each of these LOBs, especially the customer services department, weighs in on this and actually has a seat at the table in determining how this is deployed.
Timing is everything, right? I think that's the interesting part of this conversation is we've been talking about onboarding is a time to collect information. We've been talking about, maybe later if they need to change their information. But I think one thing that Jessica, you mentioned earlier, makes me think of the financial services world, though, is, if I'm not going to pay reportable income to the payee, then I'm not necessarily going to get a W-9 or maybe even Jessalyn, maybe I won't even get the full 9 digits of the TIN, right? Because sometimes some people interpret in the KYC world that they only need to get the last 4. The problem is that at some point in that relationship with your customer, that's going to change. And now you're going to have to go to them and ask for the tax information. So I think the point Jessica is trying to make, and it's a valid one, is when is the best time? Is it when they're first onboarding, or do you wait until you're paying reportable income? I think it's certainly a business decision, but I think that there's a lot more here than just tax to consider, right? There's obviously reg compliance, but even I think, privacy issues, right? Do we really want to collect and hold PII that we don't necessarily need to report off to an agency? So,
Yeah, it's a good point. And I feel like I say this in every webinar and every podcast, probably in just daily life at this point, but it is best sat at the time of onboarding. But underlying caveat, italicized, onboarding looks differently across organizations. It's not just like a blanket like onboarding process. Everyone onboards differently. So how and where that sits is totally up to the organization. The point being that there has to be a point in time where you have processes in place to say, okay, if we don't get it now, this could result in real financial risk to the company. There are steep penalties involved. I mean, I think what intentional disregard is almost at $700 per return. Inflation is real. So, it's really important because there is a financial risk associated with all of this. So it's just designating for your organization what is the best point in time to stop the bleed, right? It's not going to be the same across every single organization, but what is the best point in time for your organization to say, okay, stop, now we're going to collect documentation that effectively would then create that or send that customer through that sustainable life cycle of the information reporting and withholding process. I think one interesting point that you made, and maybe we can revisit this, is sorting number piece, and the last 4 digits. That's a fun one. So maybe we want to expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, so in the KYC world, at least for myself, and I know Jessalyn has been running into this a little bit as well, but we've talked with folks in the industry who have, by way of practice, been only collecting the last four of a tax ID number from their customer because they feel like they're not required to collect the full nine for KYC purposes. Maybe there's, a regulation that depending on what they're paying or how much they're paying, that they don't necessarily have to go to that full extent of verification at that point. And the problem is that for example, in the 1099K world, right, in the online payment platform world, the threshold for filing the information returns has consistently been reduced. And so the problem is when you have a process in place to only collect the full 9 digits of the tax ID number, when they reach a certain point, then the IRS changes this tax law, and all of these accounts are now not documented and required to be, papered with new W-9 information. So I do think that, again, kind of back to the timing question, but also back to the overall practice, right? Is it appropriate to collect the full amount of the tax ID number, even if you aren't necessarily going to report?
Yeah, and if I could add one little colorful piece to that, to clarify what this all means, as Wendy mentioned, there's other areas that are not tax law that may allow you to do KYC on just the last 4 digits of someone's social, and then effectively reverse look up the rest of the social through other programs. I think LexisNexis is one of them. But inside of the 3406 Internal Revenue Code, it says that the 9 digits of the tax ID number have to come from the taxpayer. The taxpayer must give it to you, and in some cases it must be certified, but even in the case that it's not required to be certified, which is a signed W-9, it has to come from the taxpayer. Now, there's some exceptions to that, like a power of attorney or lawyer is the one transmitting the tax ID number, but that is in direct conflict with this idea that you can get the last 4 and look up the rest of it from LexisNexis.
Funnily enough, whenever this came up when we were talking previously, I think I said I was very shocked that was consistently coming up. So that gave me a little cackle. I'll say
I
that.
think why it came up or why you were shocked is that there are members of the government that are considering allowing that to be a practice in the KYC world, that they would only have to collect the last 4. And I think we just want to ring the bell that just because it's allowed under a non-tax law,
Right.
the
Yeah.
tax law requires it.
Yeah.
So.
Which again, if you're requesting it for one piece of onboarding, if you will, I think that goes back to those conversations of streamlining the process. So you're not asking, hey, give me your last 4, but then going back and saying, actually, no, we need all the digits of your social, which creates that level of customer friction or customer impact. Go ahead, Jessalyn.
Yeah, I was going to add one more thing to this timing question of when's the best time to collect the tax ID number. As Jessica mentioned, it is heavily dependent on each business and their business model and what products they have. But the point is that you just need to figure that out and document it. We kind of use these terms crypto native and TradFi. And TradFi are traditional financial institutions that have gotten into digital assets. Think of like a Robinhood. Crypto natives are companies that were born from crypto and have never really done any kind of tax information reporting in their past. So if you look at a product like a traditional financial institution, it is much easier to say, I'm going to get a W-9 from everybody as they open an account, and you just can't get an account open unless you give a W-9 because your customers are accustomed to that. People are used to being asked for that in the context of TradFi. But the answer is very different amongst the crypto natives. Some of them that I speak to, they are doing testing to find out where do they get the cutoff? Where do they lose customers in the moments that they ask for a 10, they ask for 4, they ask for 9? And they are seeing really heavy drop-offs from their customers because in the context of crypto, their customers simply are not accustomed to being asked for that. So in the crypto space, they really have this high sensitivity to, or digital asset space, only asking for it when it's needed. And then that comes back to our earlier point, which was you need really, really good guardrails in place to detect when has a customer added a new product that would trigger a 1099. So that's some of the differences that we see between what we call the TradFi and the digital asset or crypto natives.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point because when we start talking about the best times to collect tax documentation, and with your point on the crypto specific companies, obviously they're not going to collect a W-8 or W-9 from every single person who downloads the app, right? So it is important to designate that point in time while understanding that those guardrails, like you mentioned, are so important because we know the IRS loves gaps. We know they love gaps in processes. We know they love to come in and ask for, what are your processes and procedures? Let me see what you do. And the second they start dissecting that and see gaps, that gives them an area to dig into. That gives them an area to focus on. And that results in potentially financial risk to the company. So I think, to try to tie all of this up a little bit, when we start saying, stop the documentation bleed, you do have to get documentation. You do have to get some information, but how and where you do it is specific to your organization. There is no one size fits all. Obviously, that's where we all talk to companies about this day to day on where this process fits best within an organization, depending on your specific use cases. Just emphasizing that by product line, by threshold, these requirements are important. And obviously this applies across income type, but specifically focusing in the crypto world, it is a bit of a different unicorn, if you will. There's been a lot more pushback in that industry than there has in other industries on, well, we just don't want to do this. And we understand that, but it's also that transition relief only applies for the rest of this year. Um, Hence why we're having the conversation now on stopping the documentation bleed, because come 2026, you're expected to be collecting this information. So today is the conversation on great. How are you going to create a sustainable process for your organization? But how are you also going to go back to remediate those current historical customers? Because even, okay, fine, they're out of scope today, but their transactions in 2026 are not going to be. Right. So how do you get them into that process that effectively puts them into that customer life cycle of documenting, of monitoring for changes in circumstance and things like that?
I think one other thing I would add to this conversation is also just, given that, as Jessalyn was saying, crypto native companies, they haven't really been information reporting on 1099s or other returns. So there isn't a lot of experience within the organization. And so one thing I would say as you're building these types of processes in the organization is think about the bigger picture and the longer term, right? Right now, you might be only offering products that produce 1099 DAs. What if you need to produce 1099 INTs, 1099 DIVs, Bs, other 1099 returns? It's important that you set up a process that's going to collect information that is applicable so that you can issue a 1099 out of any part of the organization and know that you have secure documentation on file, but also that you're not continuously asking the customer for more documentation every time they sign up for a new product. So I think the other piece that I want to add here is just making sure that you're building a process that as your company adds more systems and more products to the portfolio that will be producing tax reporting data, that you're thinking about how to include those other products longer term so that you're not bothering that customer again down the road for more tax information.
So I know we've talked a little bit about how to try to stop the bleed, and obviously how we do that. It may look different between those work streams, right? The current active customers versus the new. And we've kind of lightly talked about 10 matching. Jessalyn, do you want to talk a little bit about 10 matching and B notices and all the other fun notices that organizations can see? Because that also impacts this process.
Yeah, so the IRS TIN matching program is a difficult program to get access to. It is given on an individual basis. but it is an incredibly powerful tool in that it allows the user to input the tax ID number that they have and the name that they have and confirm if they are a match or not. So this prevents phishing. So Jessica cannot input Jessalyn's name and try to get her social, or she can't input a social and try to find a name. So it is a system that tells you, are these things a match or are they not? And it might also tell you a little bit extra information like this tax ID number has never been issued. So there's, I think, 5 or 6 different outputs that the system might give you. And during the transition period, again, just for sales and exchanges reportable on the 1099 DA, the IRS has said if you don't have a certified tax ID number on Form W-9, so long as you validate the tax ID number in the IRS TIN matching program and it's a match, then you don't need to do backup withholding until you do get the certified TIN. Now, this is important to mention because if during the transition period the TIN is not a match, you may need to begin backup withholding or collect a certified W-9. So there's actually some sort of bucketing layers that start to come in when you start peeling the onion apart. Now, there's 2 times that you should consider doing, actually more than 2 times you should do a TIN match. There's the moment someone creates an account and you should do real-time TIN matching. I'll explain in a moment why it's important that it's real-time. Then you should do monthly TIN matching of all of your accounts. And then just before the end of the year, before you're about to issue 1099s, you do TIN matching again. So let's go back to the onboarding. Real-time TIN matching, why is it important? This is because when somebody creates an account with you, if you tell them, great, approved, account is opened, but it takes you 1 week to verify their TIN, that is a terrible customer experience for them to later be told, oh, that information isn't correct and we need you to give us new information, especially in the space of digital assets where people are trying to transact quickly. This can be a disaster. So if you have real-time TIN matching implemented, you are making sure that you are checking it in the moment that it's been input, which is the best time to get the correct information from that customer. So then I mentioned you should do regular monthly, at whatever cadence makes sense, TIN matching for all of your customers. Why is that? Well, Jessalyn, if she opens an account, will say, Jessalyn Dean, here's my social. But if next month she got married, maybe she changed her last name with the Social Security Administration, but she hasn't contacted your crypto exchange or your company yet to tell you that she's gotten married and changed her name. But by doing a monthly check of all of your customers, you're able to catch those moments where someone's name may have changed, it's no longer a match, and you need to get new information from that person. So that's my whistle-stop overview.
I think some people will say, that's overkill. Like every month, like do a monthly on the existing. But I think it's important for people to understand that, that exactly the scenario that you just described and that information changes. This information is not stale. It is not, unfortunately, people, and despite the fact that the scenario you gave around individuals, people might think, well, it's only a problem with individuals. It's not. I've seen this problem happen with companies more often than not, right? Because they're through M&A, because they dissolve an LLC and decide for it to become a partnership or a corp. There's a variety of things that can change a legal name or a TIN. And so I just want to point out that while we're talking about TIN matching here, and we are saying you're required to TIN match, what you're really matching is the combination of the legal name that payee gave you to the TIN number that the IRS has on file, right? So that combination is what you're trying to get matched up. And I think what we find is that sometimes the TIN may not change, but the legal name might change. And so, again, checking those things monthly and then again right before you issue 1099s is really the best way to be proactive. I do want to say, though, you mentioned, Jessalyn, it's the real-time process, right? So I'm a customer onboarding with a crypto exchange and contacted a week later to be told that my, TIN information is invalid. That's not great. But on the flip side, what happens if I'm onboarding at that exchange and I fill out my W-9 information and give you a TIN and then it doesn't match? The exchange, you have to decide as an exchange, like, what are you going to do? Are you just going to say, well, sorry, you can't open the account? I mean, listen, I can tell you coming from financial services, the bank would never not open an account. based on that issue. So I think if you're going to use the tin matching program, you absolutely have to consider, well, what's the process going to be if the tin doesn't match? What are we going to tell the customer? How are we going to treat that situation?
I want to tack on to that because there was one thing I forgot to mention earlier, but I fully agree with that comment. Like, you might still open the account, but warn the customer, hey, we might need to do backup withholding or we might need to follow up with you, but we're going to get the account open. Because also, I'm sure all of us here would agree, single member LLCs, disregarded entities, are like the bane of everybody's existence. And so if you don't have a good process that differentiates natural people from businesses, and then businesses that are actually natural people for tax purposes, you will absolutely get a lot of name tin mismatches. Hands down, that's a huge contributor to name tin fails. But the tin matching program has existed for many years before we had any of this transition guidance. Why does it exist? Because at the end of a tax year, when a company issues a 1099, they issue it to a name and a tin combination. When the IRS processes the name and tin combination, if they do not match Social Security Administration records or IRS Business Master File, the IRS will send what's called a B notice to the institution that issued the 1099 saying, this name tin combination is not a match. Here's what you need to do in order to collect correct information from your customer, and if they don't respond to you, begin backup withholding. 1 year later, you will get a penalty notice for all of those name tin mismatches, and you need to be able to demonstrate to the IRS that you do a good job of collecting valid name tin combinations, and using the IRS tin matching program is a component of a good program. It's not the whole thing, but that process that can drag on for 2, 3, multiple years. And so, one thing that we talk about is the ability to reduce B notices is ultimately your objective, because when you can reduce a B notice, you reduce the penalty and the ongoing multiple years of arguing with the IRS, or not arguing, but requesting an abatement of that penalty.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. And also, I guess talking about penalty abatements quickly, under 6721, you have to have documentation. You have to have something to substantiate so that you can try to actually abate those penalties. So I think that's one thing. That's where documentation, that's also where tin checking and things like that come important. But going back to a point that you made on friction, there's going to be friction somewhere in the process. You almost just have to pick where you want it to be. Where is the least risk for you, but at the point where it's not going to lose you the highest number of customers, for example. So I don't want, to sit here and pretend like if you do all these things that we're saying, you're not going to have friction. That's never going to happen. There's always going to be friction somewhere. But again, if you find the right process, the right place to put this within your organization, but then also account for that customer friction, there are ways to get ahead of that. There are ways to, okay, this came back with an invalid 10. So to Jessalyn's point, we're going to set up the account, but we may have to back up withhold. Putting that in big, scary red font will typically, once you've told them that you're going to withhold some of their money, right? So it just depends on how you're going to relay those types of communications. But again, I thought that was a great point to make, because this is a lot. This does require a lot of cross-organization discussions and agreement. And there is inevitably going to be friction. And that friction typically comes to customer experience folks and things like that. So I think it's important to train them to understand what type of friction they may encounter. Because no one likes doing this. No one's like, this is fun. We want to do this. We want to set up all these like horrific processes, but they're not going away. So I, think the point is that how can you best streamline it and set it up for success within your specific organization in the least customer impactful way possible?
I think another thing I would add to this is Jessalyn talked about real-time tin matching. There's the bulk tin matching program as well, which, as you mentioned, it's you can do that, in bulk. And why that's important, of course, is that you can check all of your existing customers through that process. But I would say, the IRS, as you said, Jessalyn, they built that tin matching system a number of years ago. This is a system that's been around, for 10, 12, 15 years probably. And so my point there is that we all know that in the digital asset space, there are enormous transaction numbers, but that there are also huge numbers of recipients. Some of the exchanges have hundreds of millions of registered users. So I think the other thing to consider here is, the overall gravity of that volume and what that means in terms of the responses that you receive back, right? Like you want to be careful about the process that you implement here, that you're not all year long chasing tins and W-9s from people, right? Or W-8s even. You want to make sure that this process is something that you can manage operationally. And so I do think that, timing is everything. And I think that the volumes, kind of the overall responses will dictate maybe the frequency in which you implement TIM matching into your process.
Yeah, one thing we haven't talked about yet is the tracking and monitoring for expiration of forms, change of circumstance, like storage and retention. Do you want to kick off kind of best practices around that topic?
Yeah, it's a great point. And I think, that emphasizes again that this is not a one-time process. You're likely not to just get documentation one time and that be the end of it. It is important that you need to hold and store that information. So how you do that becomes important. W-9s, yeah, it's a short little page if you're getting the W-9, but it's still a pretty complicated form to complete, especially when we start talking about single member LLCs and disregarded entities. So going back to that 10 checking example where, Jessalyn changed her last name, obviously you need a process in place if Jessalyn goes in and says, "Hey, I did change my last name." Now, obviously there's no regulatory requirement for Jessalyn to do so, but assume she's super due diligent. So she went in and she change my last name, I'm letting you know. Well, that's a change in circumstance that renders the information you have on file, right, incorrect. So you now need a process to re-loop Jessalyn through that customer life cycle to effectively almost re-onboard her and make sure you do have the right information, the right legal name, the right TIN on file. It gets even more complicated when we start talking about W-8s because your W-8s, for the most part, have genuine, expirations. So for your W-8 bin, for example, it's going to be valid every 3 years. So the end of that third year, you need a process in place to solicit a new form before that expires. The actual time of that expiration is going to trigger 30% withholding on U.S. source income. So the idea here is you have processes in place to store and monitor these tax forms, so you're resoliciting ahead of what could become a withholdable event. Again, retention policies are important. This is PII, so you need processes in place to securely maintain this information. I have been on calls with clients in the last year, and I kid you not, file cabinets came up. That is not a super effective way to do all of this, especially when we're talking about high volumes in the crypto space, obviously. So it's just coming up with a sustainable way to store that information, to monitor it, because it is a life cycle. It's not a one-time event that you just check the box and you're done.
Yeah, I would like to add that I think that was such a great point because this is the thing, right? I've been audited by the IRS within 24 hours-ish of receiving an information document request from the IRS. You have to be able to produce back the documentation that they request. And so if, for example, they're asking me for evidence of W-9s that I collected for tax year 2022, right? I need to have a good, reliable repository and process to go and get that information and be able to prove to the IRS that that document was valid when I filed that 1099 form for that year. And to Jessica's point, if in that 2022 calendar year, I gave a W-9 and then in April I changed my name and came in and gave another W-9, right? That information is going to look different for the first part of the year than it did for the second part of the year, and you need to be able to show the IRS that something changed if you're being audited. So it is very important for that reason. The other thing I would say in this conversation is, again, coming from practice on this, if you don't have a good centralized location to store all of the documents for your customer, how's everybody going to know what you have on file? If you're storing them in that file cabinet that you just talked about, Jessica, my goodness, like how is somebody across the organization going to know what Wendy submitted when no one can see that information sitting in the file cabinet? So I think having a good systemic way to solve and store this information so that everybody in the organization is working off of the same information is just super important.
Yeah, I've seen some cases recently of that where someone's telling me an awful story about how they got audited by the IRS. And it turns out that they had change of circumstances that they never knew about. There were other parts of the business that knew about the change of circumstance, but they had not created that communication. You're kind of treated as if the organization knows about it, then your tax team should know about it. And for the non-tax expert that might be listening, you can also have a change of circumstance where someone is a W-9 and they become a W-8, or a W-8 becomes a W-9, because people move. Humans are migratory. And somebody could be a German citizen. They go to the United States. They're there for 9 months. During that time, they become a U.S. taxpayer as a W-9. And then later they move back to Germany and they're no longer a W-9. They're back to a W-8. So people can not only have changes within the form type that they have, but they can also change between form types.
I think it's a good point, and this actually came yesterday in a call. It's also important to track these forms, not because they do just genuinely expire, but to your point, if there's a change in information, a change in form type, that has a domino effect to how you withhold and how you report, right? So if you're withholding under two different rates, let's say for half the year, we're talking about our non-US German citizen over here. Let's say for half the year they qualified for a treaty, but the other half of the year didn't. That can result, depending on U.S. source income and stuff like that, that can result in two different 1042Ss. If we go back to your W-8, W-9 example, that results in a 1099 and a 1042S potentially. So tracking the documentation process, tracking what you have on file for a customer within a given tax year actually is necessary. This is how you stop the bleed of reporting incorrectly. So it truthfully is a knock-on effect, and that's why it's typically your first line of defense when it comes to setting up these processes and procedures, which echoes why it's so important to find the right place, the right fit for that documentation collection and validation process. Usually I say that hand in hand. I don't think I've actually said the word validation quite yet, which I am surprised by, but equally important to validate the information as it is to collect it.
You also reminded me of another really important component. We've talked about the customer service piece and having customer service teams involved, but especially in the digital asset space, just one day asking your customers for their social security number, like sending them an email and saying, click here to give us your social security number. No one's clicking on that. We live in an age where our identities are in precarious digital situations. And so there really needs to be a communication plan with both existing customers that you're repapering and new customers that you're onboarding. Even though the new customers are kind of hitting friction, you need to communicate with them as to why you're asking for the information. And so the remediation effort really becomes, soon we will be contacting you to ask you for some personal information. Here's why we're going to ask for it. But don't do that at the moment you're asking for it. Like actually tell them in advance of asking them for it that you're going to be asking for it. And then later you actually do ask them for it. This is going to differ by industry. I'm just sort of showing or explaining the far end of the spectrum of really kind of digital asset and crypto native exchanges that you really need to think about the communication plan that is adapted for your type of customer.
It's such a great point. Oh my goodness, Jessalyn, like that. I mean, I was thinking about here at SOVOS, we're constantly, our information security team is constantly doing phishing attempts to try to make sure that clicking on things that we shouldn't click on. And so to your point, like the old way of sending out something and click on this email and go here and fill this out, like it's just not going to work, right? This is a different type of industry. And even in some of the traditional space, I think we're going to start to see that become a problem. So it is important that the solutions that we're implementing are, going to be more forward thinking from a technology perspective and going to be something that, people can trust and rely on. But I think the other thing that resonated with me when you said that was this goes back to the stakeholder conversation that we started out with, right, early on in this, which is like there is like prepping your customer ahead of time so they know that this is coming, as opposed to here, complete this W-9 today, click this link, right? And the same goes for 1099 DA reporting, right? I doubt most people are thinking about just issuing 1099 DAs for the first time next year. I would hope that, as part of this project, you're also getting your stakeholders involved to notify your clients to expect to receive a new 1099 starting for 2025 returns as well. So similar approach should be taken here.
Yeah, it's not lost on sensitive information we're dealing with, and that has its own knock-on effect, if you will. Going back to preparing customers for these types of communications, I've seen a lot of clients recently put FAQs on their website to kind of revalidate what they're doing. They send those FAQs to the customers to understand why they're doing it, answer some basic questions, and those FAQs help customers feel a little more, I don't know, that this is confident in providing this information, and that it's not, malicious, because like you said, there's a lot of spamware and stuff like that coming out there. And I've gotten legitimate emails that look a little suspect. I'll say that. So it is really important how you communicate that, when you communicate that. Yeah, I think that's a great point. And it also, again, echoes the fact that there is just going to be friction. There just is, when we're dealing with this type of these conversations ahead of time internally so you can prepare for the friction, but also externally so that you can prepare the customer, mitigates that as much as you probably can.
Yeah, and I want to add, like, again, every business is different and every situation is different. And you might just have a situation where you need people to click on something. But if you contact them ahead of time and say, tomorrow, or even 4 hours from now, you're going to get an email and it's going to come from this address and it's going to ask you to click a button. It's safe to click that button. Like, actually segregating the delivery of information from the clicking of the button is, even at a minimum, a thing that you can introduce that makes your customers feel safe, reduces the calls to customer service. I got this email, it looks like phishing. What do I do? And again, back to a point I made earlier, tax people, this is not our forte.
Yeah, it's a good point. This cues, like, what is it? The tax commercials that we see on TV where you have tax return preparers, and what do those commercials tell you? That we are not capable of talking to people. Okay, we don't know how to have the right conversations. We don't know how to communicate this best to people without sounding the alarm, right? So we're probably not in the best position to do that, because we're going to effectively put language in there to scare you into submission. So yeah, I think that's a great point.
It's hilarious, Jessica, because that is exactly what I dealt with in financial service. They would come to me and say, can you review this communication before we send it out? And I'd be like putting all the little tax stuff in there to warn people. And they'd be like, do we really need to tell them that, Wendy? Do we really need? So yeah, you're absolutely right. Like, I didn't work in customer service. It's not my forte. So yeah, absolutely right.
I mean, my husband calls me a robot, because even in personal emails, that's kind of how I write. And he's like, can you just put some humanity into your email? And I'm like, no, I must be succinct. I must quote the regs. This is really important. And he's like, let me just redraft this. So yeah, I think it's, we all have to accept our weak points, and tax people typically talk in tax jargon. And so again, we may not be the best sat to type that email, but we certainly know, how to have the conversations on where this is best sat, which hopefully, you got a little bit from this podcast today. Any final points anybody wants to make? Anything maybe we didn't touch on that's important, from how to stop the documentation bleed? Do we beat the dead horse?
We beat the dead horse.
So I think, just as to quickly wrap this up, so this was the first podcast on withholding nothing. So thank you, Wendy. Thank you, Jessalyn, for being here today as guest speakers. I hope that our listeners enjoy this, that you found this informative. Again, the idea here is to conversation of tax and technology, and not to bore you to death with the regs, despite the fact that we've said that we're tax people. The hope is to have some candid conversations, what we see in the market. I don't know, practical conversations, maybe even some banter here and there. But to have these conversations be informative. So thanks to our listeners. Thanks again, Wendy and Jessalyn. We did reference some webinars that the three of us have done previously. We're going to post that so that you have access to that in case you're a little bit more of a visual learner. And then we're also going to post a link, and you can review that link for upcoming webinars, upcoming episodes. So stay tuned.